Good morning to everybody, and welcome back after that 10-minute stretch and networking. It's great to be able to see some old friends, some new acquaintances. The one thing that has not changed during COVID-19 is the need still to network, to talk about the strategies and the issues that are impacting all of us. The session that I get the opportunity to introduce will focus on economic recovery with an emphasis on COVID-19, the pandemic, and how it has impacted all of us, including in our professional and our personal lives. Just try to get through the day without some aspect of the pandemic coming up in conversation is very difficult. And in fact, it just impacted our last session as the words, "you're on mute," have become a part of the lexicon ever to be told from now until whenever. And it doesn't matter whether it's professional or personal. I think that "you're on mute" is something that has been drawn to us and we'll use forever. But the real question is, what will it take to recover? How will various countries apply their own economic development strategies and convert those to meet the demands of industry, manufacturing, and the people that they serve? How will each country's tailored recovery strategies and culture fit into the global picture where other countries and businesses are trying to work out their own revitalization solutions and strategies? The supply chain has been disrupted worldwide, which has repercussions that have frustrated economic recovery, especially in manufacturing, which relies on materials and resources for and from other businesses. An example, and a specific local example of that in Florida and other coastal states, is to call this time of year, of course we know it comes around like Christmas and other holidays, it's hurricane season. Parts for impact windows are backordered by months instead of weeks due to manufacturing slowdowns in Asia. The retail sector, as another example, have not yet been able to bring inventories fully back to pre-pandemic levels. Meanwhile, consumers have pent-up demand and discretionary savings due to sheltering in place for such an unprecedented time frame. As the leading seaport in the United States for trade with Latin America, my port, Port Everglades, is experiencing record cargo volumes as growers and manufacturers in South America, Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean are getting back to work and moving stockpiled commodities into the marketplace. And as more and more cruise ships are restarting in the United States after a nearly 2-year hiatus, our partner cruise lines at Port Everglades are scrambling to hire qualified shoreside and security personnel. These are challenges that bring us together today to explore possible solutions. So, as the description of this session notes, there have been different economic fallouts of the pandemic varying from country to country and from business to business. It is no secret that recovery plans will vary depending on specific situation and needs of every economy. We will be joined today by 4 distinguished panelists who will answer the questions: what types of economic recovery can we observe that more than a year and a half after the start of the economic recession due to the pandemic? How will economies manage their debts, and how long will it take for them to reach pre-pandemic levels? What sector of the economic activity should be prioritized in order to accelerate recovery? And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Daniel Bachman, Senior Manager, Deloitte Services, who will moderate this plenary session. Dr. Bachman is in charge of U.S. economic forecasting for Deloitte's eminence and strategy functions. He is an experienced U.S. and international macroeconomic forecaster and modeler, coming to Deloitte from IHS Economics. Prior to that, he worked as a forecaster and economic analyst at the U.S. Department of Commerce. It's indeed my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Bachman.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for not being in Miami, but of course, that's one of the more obvious fallouts of the pandemic. I'd like to introduce each of our panelists in turn and let the panelists speak for about 5 minutes on the topic. And then I'll start by asking a few questions, and we'll invite the audience to submit questions as well. I think there's a method for doing that electronically. So if you can if you're there in the forum, if you can make sure that people know how to submit questions, I'd appreciate it. We'll start with Ludovic Subram. He is the chief economist of Allianz and Euler Hermes. I apologize. I'm going to butcher the French a little bit. Prior to joining Allianz, Ludovic worked for the World Bank, the United Nations World Food Programme, and the French Ministry of Finance. Ludovic is a member of the Council of Economic Advisors to the Prime Minister of France. He's a graduate of the École Nationale de la Statistique et de l'Administration Économique and of Sciences Po Paris. So welcome, Ludovic. And I know, the virtual clapping will have to happen now. But tell us what your answers to the questions are.
Thank you, Daniel, and good morning, everybody, I guess. It's also quite unfortunate that I'm not in Miami, one of my favorite cities in the world. So I'm talking to you from Munich, as you can see from behind. So I will give you a bit the European perspective, because you guys, live in the US, and there are some other distinguished panelists that can answer that question. The idea is in March 2020, to avoid recession and tears and, unemployment and bankruptcy, the world decided to save everything. Central banks, ministries of finance joined forces to make sure that we will not have the type of crisis we had in 2008. As a result, we have now debts and inflation. And the big question that most economists are concerned about is whether we will get back to more growth, more productivity going forward. Why do I say this? Because we are right in this period where a lot of people are concerned about inflation, and people are concerned about indebtedness. And this is important because, as I said, there is this Faustian pact between Treasury and central banks. And for us economists, it's something that we are not very comfortable with, because it means that we are concerned that the policymakers may make some mistakes. Yeah. And so this is important for you as business leaders, because the next decade will certainly be driven, I hope, by less pandemic uncertainty, but certainly by a lot of policy uncertainty. How do we unplug pandemic aid? How do we recreate the business climate without the government over-welcoming its stay in the the way that the private business works? How do we handle some of the, I would say, legacies or scarring effect of this pandemic? Dislocation in the capital market, dislocation in the labor markets. And you just mentioned that in your introduction, dislocation in global trade. This is important. Daniel, you mentioned I work for Allianz. Allianz is the largest investor and insurer in Europe. But I also work for one of the subsidiaries of Allianz, which is the trade credit subsidiary, Euler Hermes, right? And so we notice what's happening with global trade, which is something that we haven't seen for the past 10 years, maybe 20 years, which is, the cost of trade has quadrupled. And this is interesting because trade is part of the solution, but this supply bottlenecks, this logistics bottlenecks, this input inflation is something that is going to stick with us for the next 2 to 3 years. And for some companies that don't necessarily have the right pricing power, this is going to be their new normal. And so as we recover, as we try, in addition to that, we try to solve one of the world's largest issue after maybe a pandemic, which is climate change, we can have a bit of pressure to do it ourselves as the private sector, or to sit back and let the public sector do it with a bit more regulatory and tax pressure. And the reason why I say that is because I do think that the next decade, and especially in the fight against climate change, but also in this realization that one of the way out of this pandemic towards more growth is through more globalization, more digitalization, more cooperation, we're going to have to make sure that we work hand in hand with governments to avoid a form of additional burden in the way we do business. So I'm quite concerned when I see trade war reloaded. I'm quite concerned when I see in Europe how the regulator goes a bit too fast and abruptly in trying to decide what are the sector pathways for energy, transport, utilities. I'm quite concerned sometimes when I see in the US that what's happening is a complete shift of business model where the private sector has to do the heavy lifting in a world where we're barely recovering. So for me, these are the topics that are going to bring us to the next decade. Digital, of course, green, of course, social and inclusion, of course, but all of that in a world that is a post-war world where we have a lot more public sector presence in the life of businesses. And also we have a bit more polarized regions of the world when we have global challenges to face. And I do think that the private sector solutions and private sector led solutions, especially if I think about impactful infrastructure, we are on the verge of a nice infrastructure cycle. If I think about solutions for health, all of that should come really from the private sector. And so for me, there is a momentum, there is a window of opportunity, but we need to be careful about what we got from this pandemic, the legacies, the scarring effect, because that could be a bumpy decade ahead, especially if the regulators or the tax agencies put the cart before the horses. So we need to be very on our toes on that one.
Okay, thank you, Ludovic. That's a great way to start off. And I have to tell you that when I'm doing forecasting, both of those issues, but particularly the trade issue, is a very important question. So I'm going to come back to that question after we finish our round of discussion. For the next person, I'd like to ask Jamal Solo. He is the Secretary of Commerce of Florida and the President and Chief Executive Officer of Enterprise Florida. And he's in the room, unlike me and unlike Ludovic. But of course, it's a little easier, Jamal, for you because you don't have to get on a plane. You're right there. He's as the Secretary of Commerce and leader of IEFA, the principal economic development organization for the state of Florida. Jamal works closely with economic development partners and private sector businesses across the state to strengthen and diversify Florida's economy. So let's welcome Jamal Solo and hear what he has to say about the questions that have been posed.
So real quick, ask the question one more time.
We're talking about the global economic outlook and how we're going to be recovering from the pandemic.
Perfect. The reason why I asked that, because I like to be very specific, because I tend to go off on a tangent. so I wanted to, you can hear me? Is it too loud? Okay, all right. So essentially, in terms of the environment that we're in right now, when the pandemic happened in March of 2020, everything slowed down, everything shut down. And for us, we saw a change in tourism in the state of Florida. Florida historically has been a state that was driven by tourism, agriculture, and visitors who came to Florida just to see it. That helped with our sales tax and the money that we made as a state. So the shift really happened around the fall time when people wanted to be out. They wanted to still live their lives. And with Florida really taking the approach of we wanted to stay open because every job is essential, especially when it's your job. If you are a mechanic, if you are from the Caribbean selling a product, if you are wanting to export something, we wanted to give people the freedom and the liberty to do that. Because not everybody's going to have degrees from elite schools or go to college at our great schools here in South Florida. Some people want to work right out of high school, be mechanics, plumbers, electricians. And what that did for us was that put us at a better place than many other states. And because of that, you had people coming here from New York, people coming here from Chicago, people coming here from San Francisco. And even though they would say, well, what are you all doing in Florida? Those were the same people who were now wanting to move down here because they knew that their people had to work, their people had to live. And because we were open, we are now having a faster economic recovery. Right now, the national unemployment is around 5.4% or around that number, and we're now at 5% unemployment, which means that we are doing well as in compared to our peers. So we look at California, we look at New York, and look at others. We are going in the right direction because I came from the port world, and in the port world, things still had to keep going. Houses still had to be sold. I was in New York with Margie Grant the other week with the Florida Realtors, and they kept saying, well, we're on lock here. We want to come down to Florida. And I said, well, I thought on the news you all said how great New York was. But so for us, that really has made a difference in regards to our approach. But our economy is recovering faster as in compared to our peers and our competitors. And right now we're at a very good place because of what was done in 2020. So I look forward to talking more about that.
Okay, thank you. That's a useful reminder about coming out of the recovery. And I think we'll come back to the tourism question. I have some questions for you about how Florida is set for its future. But I'm going to leave that for now and turn to Jose Luis Manzano. Again, I apologize. Being an American, my Spanish and my French are not very strong, to put it mildly. But Jose is an Argentinian businessman with a deep understanding of Latin American public policy and global emerging markets. He founded the international firm Integra Capital, private equity and merchant banking firm. Prior to his business career, Mr. Manzano served as majority leader in the lower house of Argentina's National Congress from 1983 to 1991 and was appointed as Homeland Security Minister under President Carlos Menem. So he has a great combination of both business and government experience, which always, I think, gives us an interesting perspective when someone has moved back and forth like that. So please welcome virtually Mr. Manzano, and let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you hear me well.
I can hear you. Can the room hear you?
Yes.
In Miami?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, I would say that we are facing a different speed recovery and different policies for recovery. I would say when you look at the US government and the European Union effort for recovery and their recovery packages, it's been a clear monetary easing intervention, a clean sanitary protection of the population, giving time to vaccines to come or to treatment to come and do their role. And meanwhile, the economy slowed down. The government intervened to phase out the, I would say, stagflationary effects of the pandemic. When I say stagflationary effect of the pandemic, it's because the disruptions on the trade chain and the supply chain will show up impacting in inflation that is not only coming from the monetary easing, but also coming from bottlenecks and disruption. Just the mention of 4 times the cost of trade illustrate that they are not only monetary results of the government intervention. They are also results that not come from the government intervention, but come from the disruption in the supply chain. So this is happening in the high-income world, in the central countries world, in emerging markets, and now I will refer, for economy of time, to Latin America. I think we are in a perfect position to have a second lost decade. And why I say that? Not because I'm a pessimistic, but the region is having their lowest intra-regional coordination in decades. The region is very polarized ideologically, and the ideological polarization has destroyed or paralyze the regional integration processes, and the electoral shifting in some of the countries or many of the countries create more precaution on the investment side. So you see countries like Ecuador that become a rising star because they voted for a moderate government. And you see countries like Peru, where they already have chosen a president from the left with minority in Congress. So the market put a yellow light on it. You have in Chile, that was always the lighthouse of economic freedom. You have a constitutional assembly going on with a lot of discussions on government intervention in private property. So that put investors on at least on hold. But if you look at the indexes in Chile, it's not on hold, it's on a slow exit. Then when you look at Argentina, Argentina is in, I would say, too long negotiation with the IMF and 50% inflation and very, very low foreign direct investment. And when you look at Brazil, the management of Brazil of the pandemic isolated Brazil from the region and from most of the world. This is still red zone. You cannot fly from Brazil to Europe. Very difficult to go from Brazil to the US. If you're going to go from Europe to the US, the only place you don't want to touch is Brazil. So in this situation, there is no articulated conversation from the region with the multilaterals, IMF, World Bank. So the region doesn't have a position, and the Summit of the Americas is not considered a tool, but is considered a scenario for political discussion instead of a tool for promoting business and investment. So what to do on this situation, on what I think the region should do? The region should do an effort to engage into the reconstruction effort. And for the region to be engaged into the reconstruction effort that is being led by the US and Europe, the region has to offer a set of policies of commitment to market-friendly policies with a lot of social inclusion, because if not, these elections will keep happening, and try to allocate part of the SDR, the special drawing rights that have been over-allocated to very rich countries, try to bring down some of that money, try to attract private sector into the reconstruction, and try to attract the multilaterals like the IDB and the World Bank to create a conversation common to the region on how to recover. Without that, will be a set of countries in the same geographical place having individual conversations. Because of the miracle of science, we will all turn the page on the pandemic because vaccines and treatment will finish the job. People will turn the page and the region will disengage for the opportunity to reconstruct better, to reconstruct green. Last comment on trade and supply. I think the region, except Mexico, is not seeing how deep is the discussion on onshoring and nearshoring. It's a deep discussion inside the US, and it's a deep discussion inside Europe. So if the region wants to seize that opportunity of nearshoring, the region has to offer certainty as an ally of the US and the European Union. Has to offer certainty, have to offer long-term commitment. Because if you are the security advisor of President Biden, or you sit at the European Commission and you have to plan your supply of copper, lithium, rare earth for the next 30 years, you will not do it with an ally that is not reliable. And I don't even see that in the discussion on the local leadership. The region has fractioned too much. So we think there is an opportunity. We are optimistic. We work all day on trying to create those conversations, but time passed. So there is no guarantee. So I would say the region is facing a situation in which things can go better, much better, or very bad. And it will not happen unless there is an active action to re-engage the region with the US and Europe.
Okay, thank you. That's a great point of view from south of the United States, where I sit, and for what I'm looking at, and in particular, the question of the relationship between Latin America and developed countries is clearly key. We'll talk more about that, but before we do, let's get to our fourth panelist, who is also in the room, unlike me, Bill Harris, Chief Executive Officer of Nirvana Technology, founding Chief Executive Officer of PayPal, and former Chief Executive Officer of Intuit. Bill has run or started 11 financial technology and cybersecurity companies. His new venture is Nirvana Technology, a digital credit card being built by a top flight team in Miami. So let's welcome Bill, and maybe he can tell us a little bit about what technology is going to help us or hinder us on our journey to recovery.
Thank you. How many of you remember the opening line of Tale of Two Cities? What was it? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's what we've got. As far as the economy goes, we have a tremendous opportunity to continue, but also to accelerate the digital transformation of so many industries. We've already seen it in my lifetime. I've worked in media and then in financial technology. And in the media, my God, the old media that I used to work at, New York City, advertising agencies, magazines, broadcast TV, I mean, it has crumbled. Meanwhile, however, the media sector has skyrocketed and is many times larger and more profitable than it ever was before. I now work in financial technology, and the financial sector has been much slower to adopt technological solutions, but is still seeing a tremendous upswing in innovation and delivery of customer benefit. Retailing, my goodness, physical retailing, we all know the hard times that have befallen that sector. And meanwhile, however, it's not like retailing has gone away. It has just been redirected into a new technologically driven channel, led, of course, by Amazon. But it's not only things you would buy from a warehouse, it's even things you would eat. We would never have thought previously to have our restaurant meal delivered to us in our homes. Another example of where the pandemic has rapidly accelerated, probably taken 5 or more years off of the slope of the adoption of digital technologies in many sectors. If you look forward, artificial intelligence, it's hard to understate the impact that will have across many, many industries, and even manufacturing. The things that are happening in manufacturing with robotics and 3D printing and so many of the technologically driven processes, that too, even manufacturing, will undergo some rapid transformation and probably pull back a lot of the manufacturing from overseas onto the U.S. shores. So, from the point of view, from my perspective, of the technology's impact on the economy, I think it's just going to be even more fantastic over the next 5 or 10 years than it has been over the last. That's the best of times. The worst of times, I'm afraid that the impact of technology has been at least as deleterious as it has been beneficial. And so, if you look from an economic point of view, the income inequality in this country has absolutely skyrocketed. We are now, and partly because of technology and partly because of the outsized profitability that can come from technology, because it is one of these businesses where typically one or two companies win. Income inequality in this country, we are now, I think, below 100 in terms of the countries in the world. And so that's only going to get worse, because the same things that drive that income technology on the upside, on the top end of the spectrum, with more and more wealth being concentrated in fewer and fewer people, or even fewer and fewer classes of people. At the same time, at the bottom end, what we're seeing is a wholesale move of workers going from salary to piecework, essentially gig economy jobs. And so that problem of income inequality is going to accelerate. And it's not only income-based, it's also status and self-worth. And what we're finding, particularly with mass media, such as social media, but also with television before it, is that people who would otherwise have been relatively satisfied with their lives, with their family, their community, now all of a sudden are bombarded with constant images of what other people are doing, and what other people are doing that is more fun or more rewarding than what they are doing. And so I think, whereas in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, we faced as a society what was referred to as alienation. Alienation from the natural world, from the way we'd grown up, from our communities, families, etc. I worry that right now what we're looking at is a disease of deficiency. We feel deficient. We feel less than others, both from an economic point of view and also from a social point of view, because of this continuous comparison with others who apparently have more than us. And then when you add the impact of what's happening in the environment, in the economy with technology. People like, in my field, the top 4 banks in the United States, each of them have in excess of 200,000 employees. My guess is by the end of this decade, they will have less than 100,000 employees, reflecting once again the power of technology, but also its power to eliminate human labor. So, I'm both optimistic and pessimistic, and and yet hopeful that we'll be able to make the world a better place for all of the citizens.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very different point of view and an important one. I hope we can weave some talk about technology into some of our discussions. As I mentioned, I believe there is a system for sending questions electronically, but I'm the moderator, so I get to start by asking questions. And I should also say that as moderator, I actually use these sorts of things completely selfishly for my own forecast. Right? I have to do a forecast every quarter. There are a lot of questions I get from our clients and internally from our partners. And so, wow, I get to ask you guys questions and then I have material to use. So I'm going to start with one that I think most of you have touched on, some of you perhaps more positively and some of you more negative. It's something I call deglobalization. And it's something that actually may have started before the pandemic, but was accelerated, as I think a couple of you, particularly Bill, noted. The pandemic accelerated a lot of things. So the deglobalization is, to some extent, this nearshoring or reshoring, but not necessarily because it's more efficient. It can also be because we don't want to be reliable on another country for vaccines. It can also be because we don't want our auto industry to be shut down because of chips in Taiwan. And it can also be because of tensions between the United States and China. So what I would like you to do, and I'll open this up to all four of you, is to talk from your point of view about whether you think deglobalization is a significant issue, whether it's likely to be positive or negative if it is, and how you each have a sort of different constituency, how that constituency is likely to handle a reduction in globalization. So does anyone want to volunteer to start, or shall I call on people? Jose? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's in the center of the problem. When I mentioned the two-speed, which actually is more than two-speed, because you have also a different speed in Africa. Inside Africa, you have a very different speed. And in Asia, you have different speed within countries and within region or sub-regions. I think the globalization was playing a role before. It has been aggravated in the pandemic because you can do a political reading of the pandemic in which you say, well, you should be more isolated and this wouldn't happen to us. To me, it's an absolute wrong reading of the pandemic. I always use an example of the lack of coordination on not having protocols for treatment. There is no uniform protocol for treatment. If you have any difficult disease in the world, doctors around 90% of the world will have access to a protocol. They mostly will read the protocol from Mayo Clinic or will read the protocol from something like that, Mount Sinai, or will talk to somebody in Johns Hopkins or somebody in Paris and get a protocol. You know the protocol. You move a bit from the protocol. I'm a doctor, so I'm familiar with this. There's no protocol here. We face a situation in which presidents were indicating treatments on live TV. So the pandemic, which is a very primitive thing, it's very old, it's as old as life, brought out primitive behavior. So you can use the pandemic to make the case for isolationism. I think that would be a cause for everybody. The learning has to be that we need to try to recover coordination, globalization, obviously recognizing national identity, obviously recognizing national security needs. But you need coordination and you need international trade. I've been talking with industrialists in Argentina now. I'm based in Europe. I couldn't go to the US from Europe. I had to create a 15 days buffer. So that tells you how bad we are. And talking to industrialists and their cost of shipping for basic material for their industry has gone up 4 or 5 times. 4 or 5 times. That's my partners are traders, and 4 or 5 times. That will not go down fast. Was mentioned previously by one of the panelists. Then, if you exaggerate on the onshoring, you will use national security issues to disrupt global efficiencies. So this is a challenge. This requires coordination because this happened in the context of climate change. This happened in the context of a climate challenge or threat to all of us. So the learning of the pandemic is that everybody is the same. We all could have died or could die on the next one. Pandemic doesn't look countries, just go to species, and doesn't respect species because starting with bats, we don't know who else intervened there and end up killing people. Could end up killing dogs. Next one, we don't know who will kill. So the requirement for coordination and global effort is much bigger than ever. And the reading and the answer cannot be isolation.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to take a stab at talking about deglobalization?
Sure. Well, politics aside, and politics may end up changing many things, but politics aside, I think globalization is unstoppable. And particularly in our industry, technology industry, sorry. It is, I mean, the technology just ripples through borders faster than water through a sieve. And what you see are the big winners in technology do tend to be global winners. And the one exception I'd make is that we are in danger of, and perhaps already on our way towards, a second Cold War, but more of a technological and economic Cold War than a military Cold War. And of course, that's between China and ourselves. But what you see in the technology arena is that there really increasingly do seem to be two camps of technological development, the Chinosphere and the American sphere. That, to me, could be a major divide in the global economy, increasingly major divide over time. Beyond that, and beyond sort of the political, the somewhat reactive impulse that many countries are going through right now, beyond that, I think globalization is here to stay, and frankly, it will continue to accelerate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so essentially, the other week I was talking with my team, led by TJ Villamil, about foreign direct investment. And foreign direct investment in the state of Florida, it's increased during COVID. And because it's increased, even though you may have people having the mantra of deglobalization, for Florida, we've really benefited from being seen as an international state, as a corridor to the Americas or the gateway to the Americas. However, we do understand that there is the need for self-reliance. There is the need to help those businesses and companies in Florida grow and everything so they can then export their products around the world. So even though you may have some states who are discussing deglobalization, for Florida has been very beneficial because we have all cultures. We have all people from around the world. So the way that New York was an international hub 200 years ago, now that is Florida. And for us, our economy has really benefited from that.
Thanks, Jamal. Ludovic, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. I believe deglobalization is a myth, actually, if you look at the numbers. And this pandemic has shown that it's exactly the opposite that has happened. I call that the Amazon effect. Containers are full with finished electronics product. That's why global trade prices skyrocketed. There is no space in the container for industrial inputs, right? People turn to goods instead of services, a tradable sector versus a non-tradable sector. We have never had so much import dependency as we have now because people decided to refurbish their house and decided to be super connected. So, President Trump tried to deglobalize, he basically almost tripled import tariffs, global import tariffs. By the end of the year, we're going back to pre-Trump era when it comes to global tariff. Do we have some form of protectionism? Sure. CFIUS is a wonderful example in the US, and the Europeans are exactly copycatting what you guys do with CFIUS, doing it a bit the European way, which is even worse. Do we have issues with people traveling? Sure. Look, this is a form of protectionism that you guys are welcome in my country. I'm not welcome in yours. But we need to start measuring globalization differently. The good old measures of industrial revolution are behind us. Cash is global. Data is global. This is the true globalization ahead of us. Do we have politicians trying to relocalize and reshore? Yes. Will company do it? No, because it is a dent on your profits. We asked several thousand American firms whether they think about reshoring, and they said no. Less than 15% of the surveyed companies told us they were serious about reshoring part of the production function. Remember, under Trump, some companies actually decided to outsource some of the production function to serve some of the Asian markets. You remember the very famous Harley Davidson example. Do we have to make globalization work for the masses? Yes, we need just globalization. Today, my country, France, we got industrially depleted because of globalization. The country I'm in and I work for now, Germany, it was a boom for them. Do we want that to continue to have more winners than losers? No. So how do we make globalization work for others and ahead of us? The big question is work from home. Does work from home means that we are on the verge of a massive outsourcing in the service industry? How do we handle that so that it doesn't have too big of a cost, right, on the white collars after the blue collars got outsourced in a way? These are the type of questions. But are we deglobalizing? No. We're just globalizing very differently. And we are understanding that these transformations, these massive transformations like globalizations, have to be handled a bit more politically instead of being run only economically. And that's why it gets a bit messy.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to bring up two things that are a little less long-term, but if you think in terms of the next 5 years, they're actually quite important to economies, and particularly Europe and the United States have experienced what appears to be a kind of labor shortage, if it is a labor shortage. We're arguing about that, but I certainly am on calls constantly with clients, and I see Ludovic might have similar experience where we're being asked, well, how do we find workers? Where do we find workers? And so I want to ask, to what extent is this sudden experience something that developed countries are going to be facing for more than just a few months or maybe a year? Is it some kind of permanent thing that companies are going to have to get used to? And how does the developing world fit in if there is such a thing as a labor shortage in the developed world? So I'll start with that and leave it open again. Ludovic, maybe you want to start because you can either contradict me or say it's similar in Europe.
Well, I think what we see is that lockdown or post-lockdown economics are revealing the structural vulnerabilities of labor markets of countries. In the US, you see that very low wages, very low social protection, reserve wages that are quite high, or people that are geographically a bit far from their job. This is what is creating the labor shortage in the construction sector, hospitality sector, and so forth. The US before the pandemic was close to full employment, but there are still 8 to 9 million jobs missing to go back to full employment. So, how can you be in a shortage when you still have 8 million unemployed people? And that's not, the unemployment benefits that is creating this. There is an issue about, how much risk, what do you value more between early childhood education and going to work for $5 an hour at a restaurant, with the possibility to get a pink slip around the corner. So the US has these issues. In Europe, it's very different. In Europe, we decided to handle the pandemic with this partial furlough. So we didn't have a huge increase in unemployment like in the US. Actually, people were kept on the job with a very generous scheme by governments. And so right now, when we hear about unemployment in Europe, we see that there is very little unemployment. There is a halo of unemployment, people that stopped looking for a job because, hotels or resorts were closed, right? And we hear the same issue, right? In Europe, and maybe the UK is very different because they stopped immigration, so they have a problem. They don't have truck drivers. That's why the Queen, Her Majesty, may have to run a gas truck. I don't know if you saw this internet meme. So apart from the UK, in my country, France, we hear companies complain, we cannot find workers, etc. We have 8% unemployment. Among the youth in my country, 18% unemployment. It's not that you just don't find people. It's just that you have to rethink the way you attract them. Pay them more. Joe Biden is famous for having said that. But in my country, for example, in France, to get an apartment, you need to have an open-ended contract. That's the security the owner asks you to basically rent the apartment. So these type of labor market rigidities explain why there is an apparent labor shortage. In my country also, or in Europe in general, what we see is that we have the beer drinkers. Germany, Holland, they have labor shortages. But in the wine drinkers countries, France, Italy, Spain, unemployment is still very high. So the question is whether we're going to see maybe a bit more internal migration, or whether the pandemic has stopped that because people for a few months were not capable of going back to their home, because some of the flights intra-regional were stopped, right? So these are the type of issues we have in Europe, which are a bit different from the US. In the US, I can understand people will let go. So to re-enter, they ask for a bit more. In Europe, people will not let go. The big issue now is that we have this internal rebalancing, but it may be the same in the States between countries that are net employer and countries that are net receiving of employers, right? The labor shortage issue is going to be with us for quite some time, maybe because of the reopening that is messy, but more importantly, because it was a service sector crisis. And so the pandemic revealed some of the problems we had before. We didn't invest enough in training. We didn't invest enough in labor market reforms, and we didn't invest enough in solving those barriers to enter the job market, especially in the school to job transition. And I guess some of these ones may apply to the emerging world, but maybe Jose Luis or other speakers may want to take that.
It's funny. In America, it's the opposite. The beer drinkers are unemployed and the wine drinkers are not. And, I think what you said about the U.S. economy is correct. In other words, that it's not a matter of there being not enough workers. The structural mechanisms in the economy, for instance, how much people are being paid to do the work at the bottom end of the spectrum, that's what's driving this feeling that there is a labor shortage. Yes, there of course are dislocations because of the pandemic and other things, but is there a labor shortage, a long-term endemic labor shortage? No. The highest level, or the most generalized level in which you can take a look at that, is the average incomes in real dollars of people who are lower and middle class in this country. And it has been flat. It has been flat for 20 years. And if there was a labor shortage, that would not be the case. Those incomes would be rising.
Jose, we have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, in South America, here we reflect the two speed. We have the different situation. We have high unemployment aggravated by the pandemic. After vaccination, going back to work, maybe tourism and construction will rebound fast. But the thing is about correct or incorrect economic policies. For us, here is not labor shortages, it's job shortages, and it has to do with the lack of investment.
Okay, thank you. Jamal, do you want to say anything?
Yes.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so in Florida, when we were hit, obviously, tourism was drastically impacted. I actually came here to the Biltmore Hotel to meet with the CEO. He was just saying the trouble that they were having with getting people in the rooms and all of that. And we have seen it come back gradually, but there still is the labor shortage here in Florida, not as much as other places. But the tourism sector is really rebuilding every single day. And as we think about the future, we still do have to think about this new generation of people coming up who are tied into technology, tied into being by themselves on the phone. So labor does have to reinvent itself and even a change for the future generation who may not be used to coming to a desk every day, may not be used to coming to an office every day. And that's something that we'll have to factor into our economy.
Okay, well, thanks, Jamal. And let me thank all the panelists for going out there and giving us your opinions and answering questions. Please give them all a hand, virtually or not. We appreciate it, and thank you very much.